Hello and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Come and join my Patreon where you'll get episodes earlier, bonuses, have a say in future content, and come join my group chat. Thank you for your support. Now on to the show. Hello Warbirders. So I've got a question for you. How was the sound quality in the last episode? I've been experimenting with mics and software, and the episode on the JU-88 replacements was a bit of a fail, I think. The Defectors USA was recorded over Zoom, so it doesn't count, but how was PBY Part 1? Let me know in the comments. So speaking of Part 1, we looked at the origins and up to the famous black cats in the Pacific. So let's dive in and continue. I've got lots of Australian listeners, and they'd like to know that another huge adopter of the Catalina was the Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF. While initially acquired for standard maritime patrol and search and rescue, the critical shortage of heavy offensive strike aircraft in the Pacific forced the RAAF to use this slow, rugged flying boat as a long-range strategic weapon. Between 1941 and 1945, the RAAF operated roughly 170 Catalinas, serving with numbers 11, 20, 42, and 43 squadrons. They also converted Catalinas into Black Cats. Painted entirely in matte black and stripped of non-essential equipment, these aircraft operated almost exclusively at night. Because they lacked the speed or armor for daylight penetration against defended targets, they used their incredible endurance, often staying airborne for 15 to 20 hours, to conduct precision, low-altitude offensive operations. The RAAF used them to mine major Japanese shipping lanes, ports, and rivers. They choked off critical harbors across the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Formosa, that's Taiwan, and South China. Operations included trapping the Japanese fleet in Manila Bay in assistance of General Douglas MacArthur's landing at Mindoro in the Philippines. During crucial phases of the war, RAAF Catalinas effectively bottlenecked major oil ports in Borneo, preventing essential fuel supplies from reaching the Japanese home islands. Dropping magnetic or acoustic mines required flying as low as 100 to 200 feet at a sluggish 100 knots, making the crews highly vulnerable to localized anti-aircraft fire and searchlights. While mining was their primary strategic success, RAAF Catalinas also served as heavy nuisance bombers. Dubbed Cat's Eyes operations, they flew solo night harassment raids on many Japanese strongholds like Rabaul. Just like their American Black Cat counterparts, crews would arrive at staggered intervals throughout the night, dropping bombs, flares, and yes, supposedly the empty beer bottles also, to simply deny the enemy sleep and disrupt operational tempos. My question is, did they bring the beer bottles empty, or were they drinking them on the job? Okay, just when I think I've discovered everything about World War II aviation, something else comes along. This time, it's the Australian double sunrise flights. Double sunrise. Sounds nice, right? Maybe even romantic? Hardly. The fall of Singapore in 1942 severed the vital air link between Australia and the UK. And so Qantas Empire Airways and the RAAF teamed up to pull off one of the most remarkable civilian/military transport operations in history, known as the Double Sunrise Flights. Operating from Crawley near Perth, Western Australia, these flights connected to the RAAF base at Lake Kogala near Galle in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Now, maybe these places don't mean anything to you, and that's okay. They didn't for me either before I looked into it. I wouldn't have realized either what a monumental challenge this was. I've placed a map on the Patreon page, but imagine the west side, that's the left side, of Australia. then think of the southernmost or bottom tip of India all the way across the Indian Ocean. Maybe in your mind's eye that doesn't seem too far, but it is 3,600 nautical miles across enemy-patrolled waters without any radio contact to avoid detection. Maybe 3,600 nautical miles doesn't mean anything to you either, but suffice to say that these flights remain the longest non-stop air route in terms of time aloft of any airline. In order to achieve this, these Catalinas were stripped of all non-essential gear, including de-icing equipment and insulation, in order to carry the 2,000 imperial gallons, that's 9,040 liters of fuel. The average takeoff weight for these was at or just over maximum of 35,400 pounds. All of this to move 3 passengers and 150 pounds, that's 69 kilograms, of essential mail. Because the flight was all over ocean and in radio silence, stars were used for navigation en route, and so it's fitting that the 5 CATs used for these flights were all named after stars: Rigel Star, Spica Star, Altair Star, Vega Star, and Antares Star. The first flight took place on the 29th of July 1943. So why double sunrise? Have you figured that one out yet? Well, the flights averaged 27 to 33 hours airborne. Crews and passengers routinely witnessed the sun rise twice during a single continuous flight. Seems like quite an ordeal, right? Yes, but at least those who had done it got an actual certificate inducting them into the Order of the Double Sunrise. Bonus. So to sum up, the Catalina was a frontline RAAF aircraft that saw active operational service from the very first day of the Pacific War to the very last. The Canadians were also a huge adopter of the PBY. Not only flying them, but as I mentioned before, they built them and they even had their own name for them, the Canso. The RCAF operated roughly 13 squadrons of Canso Catalinas during World War II, split between Eastern Air Command for the Atlantic Convoy Escort and Western Air Command for Pacific Coastal Patrols. The RCAF employed their endurance for a task that we haven't discussed much yet: anti-submarine duty. They often flew grueling 10 to 14-hour patrols over frigid northern waters to keep German U-boats submerged and away from vital Allied shipping lanes. RCAF Cansos were credited with destroying or assisting in the destruction of several German submarines. Here's one that needs to be mentioned. On June 24, 1944, Flight Lieutenant David Ernest Hornell was piloting a Canso A with RCAF number 162 Squadron. The squadron was operating under RAF Coastal Command control, flying out of RAF Wick in northern Scotland to patrol the waters off the coast of Norway. Hornell was near the end of a grueling 11-hour patrol when his crew sighted a submarine on the surface traveling at speed. It was U-1225, a U-boat on its first operational patrol. Hornell immediately turned to attack, bypassing the option of waiting for assistance. The U-boat crew spotted the Canso and immediately opened fire with heavy, accurate anti-aircraft fire. As the Canso neared its release point, it took catastrophic hits. The starboard engine was blown out of its mountings, catching fire and vibrating violently. The starboard wing was heavily damaged, with fuel tanks ruptured and burning. The hull was riddled with shrapnel, letting in freezing air and ocean spray. Despite the cockpit filling with smoke and the aircraft shaking so violently that it required 2 men to hold the control column, Hornell held the aircraft straight and level at an altitude of just 50 feet. He pressed the attack directly through the wall of flak and dropped his 4 Torpex-loaded depth charges. The depth charges straddled U-1225 perfectly. The explosions blew the sub's stern into the air and it sank within minutes. With the starboard engine dead and the wing actively burning itself apart, flying back to Scotland was out of the question. Hornell used all his skill to execute a masterful ditching into the heavy swells of the North Atlantic. The impact tore the tail section off and the aircraft began to fill with water rapidly. The crew managed to extract themselves, but they faced immediate disaster. One of their 2 4-man inflatable dinghies had been destroyed by gunfire during the attack, and the other was partially inflated and could not hold the entire 8-man crew simultaneously. For the next 21 hours, the crew clung to the single dinghy in shifts, immersed up to their chests in water that hovered just above freezing. Eventually, an RAF Catalina spotted them and dropped a fresh lifeboat, but it drifted out of reach due to the high winds. By the time another airborne lifeboat was successfully dropped and a high-speed rescue launch arrived, the freezing conditions had taken a brutal toll. Sergeant Sidney Bodkin and Sergeant Graham Scott both succumbed to hypothermia and died in the water. Throughout the ordeal, Hornell had ignored his own condition and continuously boosted the morale of his men, organizing the rotation into the dinghy and physically holding the weaker crew members out of the water. By the time they were all picked up, Hornell was completely blind and exhausted. He died shortly after being rescued, just as the boat reached safety. On July 28, 1944, Flight Lieutenant David Hornell was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. The citation highlighted his absolute refusal to abort the mission despite the intense damage to his aircraft. By pressing home the attack in the face of fierce opposition with his aircraft burning and precariously controlled, Flight Lieutenant Hornell displayed valor and devotion to duty of the highest order. Hornell is buried at the Lerwick Cemetery in the Shetland Islands. PBYs are credited with between 35 to 38 submarine kills, although they participated in many coordinated actions with surface vessels or other aircraft types. Thank you to John Hall, Tim Rathbone, and Matt Van Eck for continuing to be long-term Patreon supporters. And welcome to our newest free members. Why don't you commit? It's only $5 a month. You'll get to hear your name right here and get the episodes a week earlier and bonus episodes. You'll have a say in future content and be able to interact with me directly. If you are presently listening to this through Patreon, well then thank you for your support. You can also give me a good review or share me with a friend. It all helps. Now, most of the aircraft we cover are great at killing people. Not so many are great at that, but also saving lives. The PBY has done both. Certainly plenty of enemies succumbed to the cat's claws of bullet, bomb, and depth charge. But a cat's engines purring overhead for men in the water was one of the sweetest sounds of the war. Take it with a grain of salt, because this number was found by AI assistants, but up to 5,500 folks, downed airmen or shipwrecked sailors, owed their lives to PBYs arriving to save them. The Americans even gave their rescue operations a cute code name, the Dumbo Missions, named after the Disney flying elephant. Sometimes just getting the men out of the water, and not necessarily into the air, was the most important part. In July 1945, a PBY Catalina Dumbo aircraft helped rescue the 300 distressed crewmen of the torpedoed cruiser USS Indianapolis. Although they had dropped rafts and supplies, the main threat was not the water. It was the sharks. Imagine the horror of seeing this from above and knowing that you couldn't do anything about it. Well, this pilot, Lieutenant Adrian Marks, decided that he was going to do something about it, even though it would put him and his crew at risk too. They defied the regulations forbidding him to put down in heavy seas, and he brought his flying boat in for a very rough landing amid 12-foot, that's 4-meter swells. He and his crew then stuffed the fuselage with sailors. But that wasn't enough. They started using parachute cords to lash more survivors to the top of the aircraft's wing, damaging it so that the aircraft was no longer airworthy, but getting the tired sailors away from the shark's jaws. But by this time, the PBY was just a lifeboat with wings anyway. Finally, the destroyer USS Cecil J. Doyle arrived, and Marks and his crew were rescued along with the 56 sailors that they had jammed all over their PBY. Sadly, this heroic, but no longer airworthy, Catalina was sunk by gunfire from the Doyle the next morning. Lieutenant Marks was awarded the Air Medal for this heroic action. Other aircraft shared the Dumbo nickname, including B-29s that were called Super Dumbos, of course. But the PBYs were a big part of this SAR club. With the advent of helicopters, the Dumbo aircraft were retired, and this term was no longer used. Before we move on to looking at a PBY pilot, I'll mention some of the other nations that operated the PBY besides the ones I've already said. Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Denmark, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, France, Greece, Iceland, Indonesia, Israel, Japan, Mexico, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Nicaragua, Norway, Paraguay, Peru, Philippines, South Africa, Spain, Sweden. Phew! Okay, so I don't usually favor my own country in these episodes, or at least I try not to. I try to keep things as neutral as possible, although I know that I have neglected many countries over the years, such as Italy, Poland, Romania, and I'm even neglecting others now by not mentioning them by name that I'm neglecting them. But I'm going full Canadian right now with the pilot that I'm going to profile. It's not just an amazing story involving the PBY, it's also the fact that I've never heard of this man, and after researching him a bit, it's a bloody travesty. We do have our Canadian pilots here. Captain Roy Brown, who was credited with shooting down the Red Baron, Lieutenant Colonel William George Billy Barker, Air Marshal Billy Bishop, Buzz Burling, a lot of B's there. And there is another. I have never heard of Air Commodore Leonard Joseph Burchell, CM, OBE, DFC, OONT, CD. You know when you have that many letters after your name that you're a big deal, but I've never heard of him, and probably you never have either. So let's fix that. Burchell was born on the 6th of July 1915 in St. Catharines, Ontario, which is near Niagara Falls. He was bitten by the bug early, and like many before him, did odd jobs to pay for his initial flying lessons. He enrolled as a cadet at the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, Ontario in 1933 and was commissioned as a pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force, RCAF, in 1937. With the outbreak of the Second World War, he was posted with No. 5 Squadron, RCAF, in Nova Scotia, where he flew the Supermarine Stranraer, which kind of looks like one of the biplane precursors to the PBY. They flew convoy and anti-submarine patrols. Unlike any pilot I've heard of, Flying Officer Burchell was responsible for the capture of a ship. On June 10, 1940, the Capo Nola, an Italian merchant ship, was in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, just hours after Canada declared war on Italy. Burchell made a low pass over the freighter, as if making an attack, and the panicked captain ran his vessel aground against a sandbank. Burchell then touched down in the waters nearby to wait until the Royal Canadian Navy ships reached the scene. So even that action should have been enough to make Burchell famous, but we're just getting started. In early 1942, he was sent to No. 413 Squadron RCAF in the Shetland Islands to fly patrols over the North Sea. And then, in a complete change of climate, the squadron was sent to Ceylon. Only 2 days after his arrival in Ceylon, now squadron leader Burchell was flying a PBY Catalina flying boat on a patrol south of Ceylon. 9 hours in, as his plane was about to return to base, doesn't it always seem like the PBY always finds stuff just when they're getting ready to turn back? They spotted some ships on the horizon. Flying over, they saw a huge Japanese fleet known as the Nagumo Task Force, including 5 aircraft carriers headed for Ceylon, which at the time was the base for the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet. Burchell's crew managed to send out a radio warning message which eliminated the Japanese element of surprise and put the defenders on alert. Burchell would later be called the Savior of Ceylon, but in return, Burchell's Catalina was pounced on by 6 A6M-0 fighters from the carrier Hiryu. The Catalina was shot down. The Japanese fighters then continued to strafe the wreck, seriously wounding 1 crew member. Then another went down with the plane when it sank. The Japanese continued shooting at the survivors, killing 1 more. The remaining 6 surviving crew members were eventually picked up by a Japanese destroyer. But Burchell and his crew's ordeal was just beginning. They spent the rest of the conflict as prisoners of war. I'm actually very surprised that Burchell survived his captivity. As the most senior Allied officer in 4 Japanese prisoner of war camps, Burchell was constantly pushing back against the Japanese and demanding treatment for the men in the camps in compliance with the Geneva Conventions. In his first camp, he actually hit a Japanese soldier who was forcing a wounded Australian to work. Of course, for this he was severely beaten and placed in solitary, but it earned him the respect of the other POWs. Later, in 1944, Burchell ordered a sit-down strike, again when sick men were being forced to work. Again, Burchell was beat up. And this time he was sent to a special discipline camp, which definitely doesn't sound good. But it just shows that the action of 1 man can make a big difference, even in the worst of situations. In the camps where he was interned, the death rate of prisoners was 2%. The average in other camps was 30%. Not only did he advocate for the prisoners in the present, he was thinking about documenting the atrocities they were suffering for the future. During his captivity, he wrote a diary that he kept buried. The punishment for its discovery could have been instant death. But this written evidence was critical in a number of Allied post-war trials at which Burchell testified. Burchell was liberated on the 27th of August 1945 by American troops. After the war, he remained in the RCAF, serving on the Canadian attaché staff in Washington, D.C. He commanded a fighter base and was commandant of the Royal Military College of Canada from 1963 until his retirement from the Canadian Forces in 1967. But he continued to serve as an honorary colonel of 400 Tactical Helicopter and Training Squadron in the Air Reserve and No. 413 Squadron Regular Forces. Remember the initials after Burchell's name? The CD, Canadian Forces Decoration, is a long service and good conduct medal awarded to members of the Canadian Armed Forces. A clasp, which is a small metal bar that attaches to the medal's ribbon, is awarded for the first 12 years and then another for every 10 years after that. Burchell was the only member of the Canadian military to have earned 5 clasps for his Canadian Forces decoration. representing 62 years of service with the Air Force. It is said that the only other person with 5 clasps was the Queen's mother. My non-Commonwealth fans may not know that members of the royal family are frequently appointed to ceremonial, honorary, head of regiment roles within Commonwealth militaries, such as Colonel-in-Chief. Because the Queen Mum had held these honorary Canadian military appointments for over 6 decades, she automatically qualified for the same service milestones. Even though I'm unaware if she was much of a stick and rudder gal or if she had any air-to-air kills. I'm just kidding. In 1950, U.S. President Harry Truman appointed Burchell as an Officer of the Legion of Merit for renewing faith and strength to many hundreds of ill and disheartened Allied prisoners in Japanese captivity. Burchell was appointed a member of the Order of Canada and inducted into Canada's Aviation Hall of Fame, awarded the 2001 Vimy Award, which recognized him as a Canadian who made a significant and outstanding contribution to the defense and security of Canada and the preservation of Canada's democratic values. In a world where one can be a lot of things, I think we should all be a bit more like Leonard Burchell. So you would imagine that such a useful warbird would continue to find work well past the end of the conflict, and you would be correct. Many air forces kept them because they were just perfect for their role. In the RCAF, the flying boat versions were retired, but the amphibious Canso A variants remained in active military service into the 1950s and early 1960s. In addition to search and rescue, they did Arctic mapping, aerial photography, and northern supply runs before finally being retired in 1962. Maybe retired from the military, but just like many a veteran who just can't sit still, many of them got later-in-life jobs as commercial water bombers across Canada fighting forest fires. It was the same in the U.S. military. The flying boat versions of the Catalina were quickly retired from the U.S. Navy, but the amphib versions kept at their duties until 1957. The Brazilian Air Force started using Catalinas to hunt U-boats in 1943, and the 1st Air Transport Squadron, ETA-1, kept on flying them until 1982. They were just perfect for dropping off supplies to military installations along the Amazon. I love the ETA-1's insignia. It's a winged turtle with the motto, "Though slowly, I always get there." A Brazilian Catalina, a former RCAF one, is displayed at the Airspace Museum in Rio de Janeiro. When we talk about post-war career and survivors, we run into the same kind of problem that we did with the DC-3 and the Ju-52. With most of our warbirds, there are definite divisions from active military service, some post-war commercial work, and then retirement from that, and then museum or flying exhibit representation. But like those other two, and especially the DC-3, the Catalinas never really stopped working, and there are plans in the works to update her with a whole new version and keep her flying well past her 100th birthday in 2035. Paul Mantz, an air racer, stunt pilot, and airline operator, bought and converted a number of surplus Catalinas into flying yachts post-war and into the early 1950s. That sounds like a great idea. I totally want a flying yacht Catalina. Let me check last night's lotto ticket. Nope, not this time. Stuart Davis Incorporated converted several Catalinas to Super Catalinas by swapping in Wright R2600 Cyclone 14 engines, which were 500 horsepower more powerful. It needed a larger rudder to compensate for the increased yaw. Younger listeners might not know ocean explorer and filmmaker Jacques Cousteau. Kids my age loved his TV specials where he went around the world having adventures exploring underwater. In addition to his ship called the Calypso, he used a Catalina to support his diving expeditions. Tragically, his second son, Philippe, died in an accident when the Catalina nosed over during a high-speed taxi test. The aircraft turned upside down and broke apart. Even after the dramatic double sunrise flights, Catalinas played a major role in the development of Australia's commercial air services by Qantas Empire Airways. A Catalina known as Frigate Bird II is suspended on display at the Powerhouse Museum, which is also known as the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, MAAS, in Sydney, owned by the Government of New South Wales. I briefly mentioned firefighting before. It's estimated that between 100 to 130 Catalinas were converted to firefighting air tankers. Although this was also done in the USA and France, Canada was by far the biggest adopter, with the provincial governments of Newfoundland, Quebec, Ontario, and Saskatchewan, alongside legendary commercial outfits like Field Aviation, Avalon Aviation, Buffalo Airways, and the Flying Firemen, operating roughly 70 to 80 modified Cansos for decades, even into the 2000s. Although no Firecats are still operating, the legacy and DNA of the Catalina is still out there, fighting fires, and probably will be as long as there is a need for airplanes to drop water on burning forests. Remember that Canadian Vickers was building Cansos under license during the war. Well, in 1944, that company was renamed Canadair, which went on to build aircraft such as the Canadian F-86 Sabres and the CT-114 Tudor trainers that are now just finally being retired as the famous Snowbirds. But they also had this experience and institutional memory in building Cansos. And there was some early work done on creating a twin-engine logistic and supply aircraft called the CL-43. In the early 1960s, the Firecats were showing their age, and with forest fires not going anywhere, Quebec's forestry officials requested that Canadair come up with something new. Although the DNA is still inside, there was a lot of evolution to make the new dedicated water bomber. The PBY was designed for long-range patrol with high-mounted, high-aspect ratio wing, designed for long-range aerodynamic efficiency and endurance, while what would become the CL-215 needed a thick, low-aspect ratio wing for low-speed maneuverability and exceptional lift. The sleek, shallow boat hull designed to minimize aerodynamic drag during long ocean patrols of the PBY was replaced with a massive slab-sided hull with a deep V-shape and a high step to break surface tension quickly, built to absorb the immense hydrodynamic pounding of rough lake water and scoop up 5,450 liters of water during low-speed surface skims in only 10 seconds. The prototype made its maiden flight on October 23, 1967, and the first delivery occurring in June 1969 to France's Sécurité Civile Protection Agency. 125 were built over the years and were so utterly successful that I've heard that in some languages, Canadair is the word for a water bomber. Canadair later became Bombardier, who later introduced the turboprop-powered CL-415. Production ended in 2015 with 95 Super Scoopers out there. Well, with climate warming occurring, there is still plenty of business for firefighting aircraft. And so enter the DHC-515, which is an upgraded version of the CL-415 being made, as I write, by de Havilland Canada. It will feature Pratt & Whitney Canada PW123AF turboprop engines, upgraded avionics, an increased water tank capacity of 7,000 liters, that's 1,850 US gallons. Even as I'm recording this, I look out the window and see the yellow smoke of forest fires, so it should be no surprise that there is a backload of orders from Croatia, France, Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. In addition to aerial firefighting, the DHC-515 can also be used for a variety of other applications, including passenger cargo transport, maritime patrol, and search and rescue. Grandma Catalina would be so proud. While over 3,300 PBYs, Catalinas, Cansos, Nomads, and Soviet GSTs were manufactured during World War II, only about 70 to 80 substantially complete airframes are left globally. Although that's a small number compared to the number built, we warbirders know that that's still a pretty good number. Currently, as far as I know, there are about a dozen Catalinas that are currently airworthy. I'm going to focus on just one. An RCAF Canso A, manufacturer number CV283, was built by Canadian Vickers Limited in 1943. Again, just about 10 miles away from where I'm recording this, and incidentally where my grandfather worked as an engineer. He died before I was born, but I should really look into what Grandpa Pierce was working on there. Anywho, this Canso was delivered to Western Air Command in October 1943 and served until May 1961. She then worked as a water bomber in Canada, Chile, and France. In 1979, she underwent conversion to a passenger plane with the idea of flying tourists around Zimbabwe. But the complicated political situation there halted the project, and she was abandoned outside in Nanaimo, British Columbia, Canada, and left to deteriorate. Plain Sailing Air Displays Limited, Catalina Aircraft Limited, from England was searching for a Catalina to restore and brought her to her new home at the Imperial War Museum Airfield at Duxford, where she arrived on the 30th of March 2004 and where she was re-registered as Golf Papa Bravo Yankee Alpha. That's GPBYA. Get it? She was then repainted to represent a USAAF OA-10A Catalina, serial number 44-33915. All the more fitting, as that one too was also built at the same Cartierville factory, with the suggested name Miss Pickup. The original Miss Pickup had flown with 5 Emergency Rescue Squadron out of RAF Halesworth in Suffolk, and was lost at the end of March 1945 after touching down on the North Sea to pick up a downed P-51D Mustang pilot. However, it suffered an engine failure and could not take off. The following day, it was shot up and sunk by a marauding Luftwaffe Me-262 jet. But the crew escaped in their dinghy, and the would-be rescuers were then rescued and taken back to England by boat. As far as I know, the beautiful Miss Pickup is still out there showing the world what the formidable PBY can do. Along the way, I have said that the Catalina might have a future. Yes. In 2023, a company called Catalina Aircraft in Vero Beach, Florida, which now holds the type certificates for the Catalina, announced an intent to build what they call the Catalina II, a new aircraft but built on the basic design principles of the original Catalina. Deliveries are projected to commence by 2029. On the datasheet available on the company's website, the following possible features are listed. Please note that I don't know what some of these things actually are. Hybrid bow stern thrusters, aerial refueling, marine gyro stabilization, adjustable height landing gear, rear cargo airdrop ramp, universal nose cone sensor power mount, 463-liter pallet cargo deck pressurization option, hardpoint external fuel tanks, and fly-by-wire pilot-optimized flight deck. The Catalina SPAR comes in an assortment of variants for different tasks. The Catalina Frigate is for passengers or cargo, while the Catalina Petrel is an alphabet soup of acronyms. ASW, ISR, AWACS, EO-IR, ESM. So that's ASW, anti-submarine warfare, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, AWACS, that's airborne warning and control system, EO-IR, electro-optical, infrared, ESM, electronic support measures. The Catalina Kestrel is a Coast Guard patrol aircraft, while the Catalina Condor is a firefighting aircraft. I would have called the maritime patrol aircraft the Condor, in honor of the FW-200 Condor, but nobody asked me. The Catalina Orkan is to be a military transport, support, and medevac aircraft, and the Catalina Ninox will be an autonomous cargo, search and rescue, anti-submarine warfare, and logistics aircraft. Did you catch that? Autonomous. I wonder what old Isaac M. Ladden, Consolidated's chief engineer, would have thought about future robot Catalinas flying themselves. So what happened to him anyway? He was very appropriately invested in 1975 in the International Aerospace Hall of Fame, and he passed on January 14th, 1976. But his designing legacy lives on in all the present and future Catalinas out there. Thank you again to my Patreon supporters. You guys keep me getting up at 5 a.m. to make this show. You can check out the photos of what we've been talking about on the Patreon page. These are available to all. Hey, why not join? There's a free option. And if you can't, why not just leave me a review? Until next time.